Hello everyone, and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the episode. Now, let's relax and let's begin. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air carried the faint scent of decaying leaves and the sky was painted in shades of fiery orange fading into deep purple. Daniel had laced up his running shoes, eager for his nightly jog. The familiar rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement always helped him clear his mind. He started down his usual route, a quiet stretch of suburban streets lined with skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the steady beat of his sneakers. As he turned onto a dimly lit trail that cut through a nearby park, he felt a sudden prickle at the back of his neck, the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking it off, he picked up his pace, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. The trail was deserted, as it often was this time of night. Just him, the trees, and the faint glow of the moonlight. Then he heard it. Footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, matching his rhythm step for step. Daniel's pulse quickened. He slowed down, hoping to confirm the sound, and the footsteps slowed too. He stopped completely, his heart thudding in his chest. The other footsteps stopped a beat later. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty park. Silence. A chill ran down his spine as he resumed jogging, this time at a quicker pace. He told himself it was just his imagination, or maybe another jogger. But the footsteps returned, heavier now, deliberate. They weren't trying to match his pace anymore, they were gaining on him. He broke into a sprint, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps behind him grew louder, closer. He didn't dare look back. Instead, he veered off the trail, plunging into the dense woods, branches whipping at his face and arms. The footsteps followed, relentless. Panic clawed at his mind. He stumbled over a root and hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Scrambling to his feet, he spun around, finally facing his pursuer. There was no one there. The forest was eerily still, the silence oppressive. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes darting through the shadows. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. Then he saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form indistinct but undeniably human. It moved unnaturally, jerking forward in disjointed motions. The pale light of the moon revealed a face that was wrong in every way, eyes too wide, mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that didn't belong on any living thing. "What do you want?" Daniel shouted, his voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as if considering his question. Then it took a step closer, and another, until Daniel could see the dirt-streaked skin and the unnatural way its limbs twisted with each movement. He didn't wait to find out more. Adrenaline surged through him, and he bolted. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together as he ran. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. The sound of snapping branches and crunching leaves told him the figure was still behind him, unrelenting. Finally, he burst out of the woods onto a main road, the harsh glare of a passing car's headlights blinding him momentarily. He waved frantically, and the car screeched to a halt. The driver, a concerned-looking woman, rolled down her window. "Are you okay?" she asked. Daniel looked back at the forest, his chest heaving. The figure was gone. The woods stood silent and still, as if mocking him. "Yeah," he lied, his voice hoarse. "Just went for a run." The woman gave him a dubious look but nodded. "Do you need a ride?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I'll be fine." As she drove off, Daniel started walking toward home, his legs too shaky to run anymore. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and he couldn't shake the feeling that one of those shadows didn't belong. When he reached his house and locked the door behind him, he leaned against it, finally allowing himself to breathe. But as he turned to switch on the lights, he froze. A muddy footprint marked the floor, leading deeper into the house. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. Mia and Lucas, two high school seniors, had decided to take a detour through the countryside on their way back from a weekend hiking trip. The rolling fields and quiet roads were a welcome break from their usual suburban monotony. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, their GPS lost signal, and the two found themselves hopelessly lost. "We'll find a main road," Lucas said, though his voice betrayed his unease. The headlights of his old sedan illuminated little more than endless rows of cornfields on either side. "There's gotta be something around here." Mia wasn't so sure. "We should have turned back an hour ago," she muttered, peering into the growing darkness. "This place gives me the creeps." Then, as if in answer to their predicament, a faint glow appeared in the distance. A farmhouse, its porch light flickering like a beacon, sat at the end of a narrow dirt road. "Look! A house!" Lucas exclaimed. "Maybe they can give us directions." Mia hesitated. Something about the place felt off, but they didn't have many options. "Fine," she said. "But let's make it quick." The car crunched over the gravel driveway as they approached the farmhouse. It was old and weathered, its wooden boards gray with age. A barn loomed in the background, its large doors slightly ajar. The air smelled faintly of damp hay and something else, something metallic. Lucas knocked on the door while Mia hung back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The door creaked open, revealing a tall man in overalls. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his lips stretched into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, now, what's this?" the man drawled, his voice syrupy and slow. "You two lost?" "Yeah," Lucas said, offering a nervous smile. "Our GPS stopped working. We were hoping you could point us to the nearest highway." The man nodded slowly, his grin never faltering. "Why don't y'all come inside? My wife makes a mean apple pie. We'll get you sorted right out." Mia shook her head. "We're fine, thanks. If you could just tell us how to get back to the main road." Before the man could respond, a woman appeared behind him. She was short and round, her hands dusted with flour. Her smile was as unsettling as her husband's. "Oh, nonsense," she said. "You'll catch your death out there in the dark. Come, come." Lucas hesitated, but Mia grabbed his arm. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice firm. "Suit yourselves," the man said, his grin fading slightly. "But the roads around here can be mighty confusing at night." As they turned to leave, Mia caught a glimpse of something, a shadow moving behind the barn. Her heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" she whispered to Lucas. "See what?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "Behind the barn. I think there's someone back there." Lucas frowned. "Maybe we should check it out. If they have a phone." Reluctantly, Mia followed him toward the barn. The door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing rows of rusted tools hanging from the walls. The air was thick with the stench of decay. In the center of the barn stood a large wooden table, its surface stained dark. "Lucas, let's go," Mia said, her voice trembling. But Lucas was staring at something in the corner. A large tarp covered a lumpy shape, and from beneath it, a single boot stuck out. "Oh my God," Mia breathed. "Is that?" Before they could investigate further, the barn door slammed shut behind them. The sound reverberated through the space, and they spun around to see the farmer and his wife standing in the doorway, their smiles gone. "You shouldn't have gone snooping," the farmer said, his voice low and cold. Lucas grabbed Mia's hand, and they bolted toward the opposite end of the barn, shoving open a smaller door that led into the open fields. They ran blindly through the corn, the stalks whipping against their faces and arms. Behind them, they could hear the couple's voices, calling out in sing-song tones. "Come back now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Mia's lungs burned, and her legs felt like lead, but she didn't dare stop. The cornfield seemed endless, but finally, they burst onto another road. In the distance, headlights appeared. They flagged down the car, a pickup truck driven by an elderly man who looked concerned but kind. "What happened to y'all?" he asked as they climbed into the truck, gasping for air. "The farm," Mia managed to say. "There's something wrong with that farm." The man's expression darkened. "You mean the old Harper place? Nobody's lived there in years. Not since the incidents." Lucas and Mia exchanged a horrified look. As the truck sped away, Mia glanced back at the cornfields, half expecting to see the farmer's twisted grin watching them from the shadows. But the road remained empty, the farmhouse fading into the night behind them. The desert highway stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through an ocean of desolation. Natalie's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as her car sputtered, the fuel gauge needle hovering dangerously close to empty. She cursed under her breath, her phone's GPS useless without a signal. As if summoned by her desperation, a flickering neon sign appeared on the horizon. "Gas," it read, the letters buzzing faintly against the twilight sky. Relief washed over her as she pulled off the road, the car's engine wheezing in protest. The gas station was a relic from another era, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. A single pump stood in front of the building, its nozzle hanging limply. Natalie hesitated. The place looked abandoned, the air heavy with silence. But she didn't have a choice. Grabbing her wallet, she stepped out of the car, the sound of her boots crunching against gravel unnervingly loud. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing in the stillness. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from behind the cracked glass of the station's door, a figure emerged. He was a gaunt man, his overalls streaked with oil and his eyes shadowed by the brim of a faded baseball cap. Despite the eerie stillness of the station, he smiled warmly. "Evening," he said, stepping onto the porch. "Car trouble?" "Just low on gas," Natalie replied, forcing a smile. "Is the pump working?" "Sure is," he said, his voice tinged with a faint southern drawl. "Why don't you go ahead and fill up? I'll get the register running." Natalie nodded and returned to her car, grabbing the nozzle. The pump groaned to life, the numbers on the dial spinning sluggishly. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but every time she glanced toward the station, the man was busy inside. When the tank was full, she walked to the station's door. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old grease and mildew. A fan rattled lazily in the corner. The man stood behind the counter, his hands resting on its cracked surface. "That'll be $40, he said, his smile unwavering. Natalie handed over the cash, her eyes scanning the room. Shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded candy wrappers. A door behind the counter was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness. "Not many travelers out this way," she said, trying to make small talk. Must get pretty quiet. The man chuckled. Oh, we get by. Folks pass through more often than you'd think. Something about his tone made her skin crawl. She forced another smile and turned to leave, but as she reached the door, a muffled sound stopped her. It was faint, like a cry, and it seemed to be coming from behind the counter. She froze. Is someone else here? The man's smile faltered for the first time. Just the wind, he said quickly. It makes all kinds of noises out here. Natalie's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity got the better of her. Are you sure? It sounded like. I said it's nothing, he interrupted, his voice sharper now. You got your gas. Best be on your way. Her heart pounded as she nodded, backing toward the door. But as she turned, the sound came again, clearer this time. It was unmistakably a voice, weak and pleading. Help me. Natalie's blood ran cold. She glanced at the man, whose eyes were now hard and unblinking. I think don't, he growled, stepping around the counter. It's none of your business. She bolted for the door, but he was fast, his hand clamping onto her arm. Let me go, she screamed, struggling against his iron grip. You shouldn't have come here, he hissed, dragging her toward the back room. In a surge of panic, Natalie grabbed a can of motor oil from a nearby shelf and swung it with all her strength. It connected with his head, and he staggered, releasing her. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. She sprinted to her car, fumbling with the keys as tears blurred her vision. The engine roared to life, and she tore out of the gas station, gravel spraying behind her. In the rearview mirror, she saw the man stumble onto the porch, his face twisted in rage. Her breath came in ragged gasps as the station disappeared into the night. She didn't stop driving until she reached the lights of a distant town. Only then did she pull over, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Later, when she told the police, they found the station exactly as she described. But the man was gone. All they discovered in the back room were rusted chains bolted to the floor and a chilling collection of personal belongings, none of which belonged to Natalie. She never drove that highway again. The storm raged outside, thunder cracking like cannon fire as rain lashed against the windows of the old house. Inside, a group of friends huddled around a small wooden table, the flickering candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. The centerpiece of their gathering was a worn Ouija board, its letters and numbers faded from years of use. This is so stupid, Sarah muttered, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. It's just a game. If it's just a game, why are you so scared? Chris teased, wiggling his fingers at her. I'm not scared, she snapped. I just think it's pointless. Let's just try it, Emily said, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. She placed her fingers lightly on the planchette. Come on, everyone. It'll be fun. Reluctantly, the others joined in. Chris, Sarah, and Jake placed their fingers on the small, heart-shaped piece of wood, while Emily took a deep breath. Is there anyone here with us? Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. Sarah snatched her hand away. Who's doing that? She demanded, her voice trembling. Not me, Chris said, grinning. It's probably Jake. I swear it's not me, Jake protested, his face pale. It's probably just your subconscious, Emily said, though her own hand was shaking. Let's keep going. The planchette stopped, hovering over the word yes. What's your name? Emily asked, her voice wavering. The planchette began to move again, spelling out the letters Samuel. Samuel, Chris said. Okay, Samuel, what do you want? The planchette jerked violently, spelling out a chilling response, you. A cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. Emily let out a small scream, and Jake fumbled for his phone to turn on the flashlight. The beam of light revealed their pale, terrified faces. Okay, I'm done, Sarah said, standing up. This isn't funny anymore. Before anyone could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. They froze, their eyes darting to the doorway. The house was supposed to be empty. Who's there? Chris called, his voice cracking. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the room. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. This is a joke, right? Jake whispered. Tell me this is a joke. No one answered. The planchette on the board began to move on its own, faster than before, spelling out a new message, get out. Emily grabbed the board and threw it across the room. We need to leave, she said, her voice trembling. Now. As they scrambled to gather their things, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The windows rattled, and a low, guttural growl filled the air. The friends huddled together, their eyes darting wildly around the room. What do we do? Sarah cried. We have to finish the game, Emily said. That's the only way to close it. Are you insane? Chris shouted. We're not touching that thing again. The growling grew louder, and the walls seemed to shudder. Shadows moved unnaturally across the room, coalescing into a tall, twisted figure with glowing red eyes. It loomed over them, its presence suffocating. Do it! Jake shouted. Emily rushed to the board, setting it upright and placing her fingers back on the planchette. The others reluctantly joined her, their hands trembling. Samuel, Emily said, her voice cracking. We're ending this. Goodbye. The planchette moved violently, resisting their efforts. The figure let out an ear-splitting scream, its form flickering like a dying flame. With a final push, they forced the planchette to the word goodbye. The figure vanished, the growling stopped, and the room fell eerily silent. The friends sat frozen, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Without a word, they grabbed their things and fled the house, not stopping until they were safely outside in the rain. None of them spoke as they piled into the car, their minds racing with what they had just experienced. As they drove away, the Ouija board sat forgotten on the floor of the old house. Its planchette moved once more, spelling out a single word, wait. The old Victorian house stood at the end of Maple Street, its once grand facade now cloaked in decay. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the wooden steps creaked under the weight of years. Local kids whispered that the place was haunted, but no one dared to explore its shadowed halls, except for the occasional thrill-seeking teenager. On a bitterly cold October night, the silence surrounding the house was broken by a group of 4 friends, Laura, Matt, Katie, and James. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they approached the house, daring each other to go inside. A gust of wind howled through the barren trees, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and rot. You're sure this is a good idea? Katie asked, clutching her coat tightly. What's the worst that could happen? Matt grinned. It's just an old house. Laura rolled her eyes. Let's just get this over with. We'll poke around, take some pictures, and leave. Easy. The group pushed open the front door, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, The air was thick and oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang. Their footsteps echoed as they moved through the darkened rooms, the beam of their flashlights slicing through the gloom. As they explored, they noticed strange details: charred marks on the walls, melted candle stubs arranged in a circle on the floor, and the faint smell of smoke that seemed to grow stronger with every step. "This place gives me the creeps," Katie whispered. "Can we go now?" "Not yet," Laura said. "There's an attic. Let's check it out." Reluctantly, they climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder, and the smell of smoke intensified. When they reached the top, they found a small, cluttered space filled with old furniture and boxes. In the center of the room stood an ornate mirror, its surface cracked and fogged with grime. "Look at this," James said, approaching the mirror. As he wiped away the dust, his reflection seemed to ripple, as if the glass were water. He stumbled back, his face pale. "What did you see?" Laura asked. Before he could answer, the mirror began to glow faintly, and the temperature in the room soared. Flames erupted from the edges of the frame, spreading rapidly to the walls and ceiling. The friends screamed, scrambling down the stairs as the fire chased them, its heat searing their skin. "Run!" Matt shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. The house seemed alive, groaning and creaking as the fire consumed it. The front door, their only exit, slammed shut before they could reach it. The windows cracked and shattered, but the openings were filled with thick, impenetrable smoke. "We're trapped," Katie cried, coughing violently. As the flames closed in, Laura spotted a trapdoor in the floor. "Here! This way!" she yelled, pulling it open. The group descended into the basement, the air cooler but still heavy with smoke. In the basement, they found themselves in a strange, stone-walled chamber. Symbols were etched into the walls, and in the center of the room stood an altar covered in ash. The fire above seemed to pause, as if the house were holding its breath. "What is this place?" Matt whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the flames burst through the floor, forming a towering figure of fire. It had no face, only glowing eyes that burned with malevolence. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice boomed, echoing through the chamber. The friends froze in terror as the figure advanced, the heat unbearable. Desperate, James grabbed a rusted metal rod from the ground and swung it at the figure. The flames recoiled, and for a moment, the figure seemed to waver. "Keep going," Laura shouted. Together, they used whatever they could find, rocks, broken wood, and even their fists, to fight back against the fiery entity. With each blow, the flames dimmed, until finally, the figure exploded in a shower of embers. The house groaned one last time before collapsing inward, the fire extinguishing as the structure crumbled. The friends emerged into the cold night, coughing and covered in soot, their faces streaked with tears. They never spoke of the house again. Days later, when firefighters investigated the ruins, they found no evidence of an attic, a basement, or even a mirror. All that remained was a scorched foundation and the lingering scent of smoke. The sun hung low in the sky as Mark tightened the straps on his backpack and gazed at the dense forest stretching endlessly before him. The trail had been clear enough earlier, but now it had all but disappeared, swallowed by overgrown vegetation. He glanced at his map and compass, trying to make sense of where he had gone wrong. Just a little further, he muttered to himself, determined to find his way back before nightfall. But as the hours slipped away, the trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches clawing at the dimming sky. The familiar sounds of the forest, birdsong and rustling leaves, faded into an eerie silence. Mark's chest tightened as the realization set in, he was hopelessly lost. As the last rays of sunlight vanished, he scrambled to gather wood for a fire. His hands shook as he struck his lighter, finally coaxing a small flame to life. The flickering light provided little comfort, barely holding back the oppressive darkness. In the distance, a wolf howled, its mournful cry sending a chill down his spine. Mark's mind raced. Wolves rarely attacked humans, he told himself. But the howl was soon joined by others, the pack's calls echoing through the forest. "Stay calm," he whispered, gripping a sturdy branch he had fashioned into a makeshift weapon. The night grew colder, and the fire cast long shadows that danced and flickered like living things. Mark's stomach growled, but hunger was the least of his concerns. He'd seen fresh bear tracks earlier and knew the predators could be just as much a threat as the wolves. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion set in. He leaned against a tree, his eyelids growing heavy. Just as he began to drift off, a soft rustling nearby jolted him awake. He strained his ears, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no reply, but the rustling grew louder, closer. Mark's grip on the branch tightened. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the edge of the firelight. He spun around, but nothing was there. Then he saw them, two glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to a wolf. Slowly, the creature stepped into the light. It was a bear, its massive form towering over him. Mark froze, every muscle in his body screaming for him to run, but he knew better. He backed away slowly, his eyes locked on the animal. The bear sniffed the air, its eyes glinting in the firelight. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and lumbered back into the shadows. Mark exhaled shakily, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. But his relief was short-lived. The air around him grew colder, unnaturally so, and the fire began to sputter and dim. A low, whispering sound filled the air, like 1,000 voices murmuring just out of earshot. Mark's breath hitched as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was a pale, featureless mask, and it seemed to glide rather than walk. Who are you?" Mark stammered, clutching his branch like a lifeline. The figure tilted its head, as if studying him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his head with words he couldn't understand. Mark stumbled back, his vision swimming. Suddenly, the fire flared, the light revealing dozens of similar figures standing just beyond its reach. Their eyeless faces were turned toward him, their presence suffocating. Mark's instincts took over. He bolted into the woods, branches clawing at his face and arms as he ran blindly. The whispers followed him, growing louder and more frenzied. His chest burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he didn't dare stop. Finally, he burst into a clearing, collapsing to his knees. The whispers faded, and the forest was silent once more. He glanced around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, revealing a strange stone altar at its center, covered in ancient carvings. Mark's relief turned to dread as he realized the carvings matched the shapes of the figures he'd seen. The air grew heavy, and the ground beneath him began to tremble. From the shadows of the trees, the figures emerged again, their movements synchronized as they encircled him. This time, there was no escape. The whispers filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts, and the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the pale, featureless face of the nearest figure looming over him. When Mark's body was found weeks later by a search party, it was lying in the clearing, untouched by animals. His face was frozen in an expression of sheer terror, and around him were the faint outlines of footprints, not human, but something far older, and far darker. The first time Grace heard the melody, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft, melancholic tune carried on the wind like a distant whisper. She dismissed it as her imagination, a side effect of the sleepless nights spent composing music no one wanted to hear. But by morning, the news had spread. Mr. Halvorsen from 2 doors down was missing. His house bore the mark. Carved into the wood of his living room wall was a series of musical notes, jagged and erratic, as though etched by trembling hands. Grace, like the rest of the town, stared at the photo on social media with a mix of dread and intrigue. Someone's idea of a sick joke, she murmured, but deep down, she didn't believe it. The melody returned the next night. This time, it was louder. Grace's younger brother, Danny, froze mid-sentence as it seeped through the walls. His face paled, his eyes glazing over. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Grace nodded, a chill racing down her spine. The tune was hauntingly beautiful, each note tugging at her soul like a forgotten memory. She tried to shake it off, but Danny rose abruptly and walked to the door. "Where are you going?" she called after him. He didn't respond. He opened the door, stepped out into the night, and vanished into the darkness. The police searched for days, but there was no trace of Danny. What they found instead were more musical notes, carved into the wall of Grace's living room. This time, they were clearer, as if whoever or whatever had made them was growing more confident. Grace became obsessed. She photographed the carvings and transcribed the notes, playing them over and over on her keyboard. The melody was incomplete, but it stirred something within her, a deep sadness, a longing she couldn't explain. "What are you doing, Grace?" her best friend Ellie asked one evening, glancing uneasily at the growing stack of sheet music on the desk. "I think this is the key to finding Danny," Grace said, her voice trembling. "The melody, it's like it's alive. It wants to be finished." Ellie shuddered. What if finishing it is exactly what it wants? Grace's sleepless nights blurred into weeks. She discovered that the melody wasn't random, it was ancient. Buried in the archives of the town's library, she found references to a symphony of the forgotten, a cursed composition said to summon a being known only as the conductor. The symphony had been incomplete for centuries, abandoned by its composer when he realized its power. The disappearances weren't random either. Each missing person had left behind a fragment of the symphony, as if their essence had been absorbed into the music. "If I finish it," Grace reasoned, "maybe I can reverse it. Bring Danny back." Ellie begged her to stop. "You don't know what you're dealing with," she cried. But Grace was resolute. The melody had taken root in her mind, growing stronger each day. She couldn't stop even if she wanted to. The final notes came to her in a dream. Grace woke with a start, the entire symphony blazing in her mind. She wrote feverishly, her fingers cramping as she completed the score. When the last note was written, the air in the room grew heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. The melody began to play on its own, echoing through the house. Grace's piano keys moved without her touch, the sound swelling into a full orchestra. Shadows gathered in the corners of the room, coalescing into a towering figure clad in a tattered conductor's coat. The conductor. Its face was obscured, but its eyes burned with a malevolent light. It raised a baton, and the music swelled. Grace screamed as the room dissolved around her, replaced by a vast, dark void filled with ghostly figures, the missing residents of her town, their faces contorted in silent agony. Danny was among them. "Let him go," Grace pleaded, tears streaming down her face. The conductor tilted its head, as if considering her request. Then it pointed the baton at her sheet music. Grace understood, a trade. Her freedom for Danny's. With trembling hands, she tore the sheet music in half. The melody faltered, then stopped. The conductor let out an ear-piercing shriek as its form began to unravel, the void collapsing in on itself. Grace woke up on her living room floor. Danny was beside her, unconscious but alive. The carved notes on the wall had vanished, leaving only faint scars in the wood. The town moved on, as small towns do, pretending the disappearances had never happened. But Grace couldn't forget. The melody still lingered in her mind, faint but persistent. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she could hear the sound of a baton tapping, as if keeping time for a symphony that refused to be silenced. It all started at a dusty garage sale on the outskirts of town. The mirror stood propped against a weathered table, its ornate frame covered in peeling gold leaf and intricate carvings of writhing figures. A small, yellowed card was taped to the corner, "Antique mirror, $20. Never play alone." "That's creepy," Sarah said, brushing her auburn hair behind her ear. But her boyfriend, Max, grinned. "It's perfect for the party," he said, handing a crumpled 20 to the seller, an old woman with hollow eyes who didn't say a word as she took the money. The group of friends, Sarah, Max, Lena, and Jake, lugged the mirror back to Max's house, where they were planning a night of drinking, games, and ghost stories. By the time they arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and a chill had crept into the autumn air. Max set the mirror against the wall in the living room, its surface catching the flicker of candlelight. "Let's see what this warning is about," he said, grabbing a bottle of whiskey and pouring shots. Lena rolled her eyes. "It's just a gimmick to sell junk," she said, but there was unease in her voice. After a few drinks, Max declared, "Let's play a game. Everyone sit in front of the mirror." The group complied, arranging themselves in a semicircle. Max explained the rules he'd just made up. "We take turns asking the mirror a question. The first one to get an answer wins." "Wins what?" Jake asked. Max shrugged. "Bragging rights?" They laughed nervously and began. Sarah went first. "Mirror, mirror, what's my future?" she asked with a dramatic flair. The mirror reflected only their expectant faces and the flickering candlelight. Nothing happened. Jake and Lena asked questions next, their voices growing more sarcastic as the game went on. Still, the mirror remained inert. When it was Max's turn, he leaned close, his breath fogging the glass. "Who's the most daring of us all?" he asked. The words barely left his lips when the candle flames surged, casting the room in harsh shadows. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and Max's reflection smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was wider, sharper, wrong. "What the hell?" Lena whispered, backing away. The ripple subsided, and everything returned to normal. Or so they thought. The first disappearance happened the next morning. Jake didn't show up for breakfast. His car was still parked outside, and his phone lay abandoned on the couch. But Jake himself was gone. "He probably went for a walk," Max said, though he looked uneasy. Sarah wasn't so sure. The night before, she could have sworn she saw Jake's reflection linger in the mirror a moment too long when they stood to leave. By evening, Lena was missing too. Sarah found her jacket near the mirror, which now seemed to hum faintly, as though alive. "Something's wrong with that thing," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Jake and Lena wouldn't just leave without saying anything. Max, pale and jittery, muttered, "We need to get rid of it." They hauled the mirror to the backyard and smashed it with a crowbar. The glass shattered, but instead of falling to the ground, the shards floated, hanging in the air like a constellation of fractured light. Each shard reflected not their faces, but grotesque, twisted versions of themselves, grinning with predatory glee. One by one, the shards reassembled themselves, the mirror reforming with an ominous crack. The warning inscription was gone. In its place were new words: "You've started the game. Finish it." Desperate, Sarah and Max began researching the mirror's origins. They found an old newspaper article about a notorious 19th century occultist who created the mirror as a gateway to a shadow world. The article mentioned that the mirror required players to complete the game to avoid being trapped forever. "What game?" Max muttered, his hands shaking as he scrolled through pages of text. Sarah reread the article. "It says you have to ask the mirror 3 questions and wait for answers. That's it. We already asked more than 3 questions last night." Max's face went pale. "So we broke the rules." The mirror's surface shimmered, and a voice echoed from within, "Only one can finish. The rest must fall." Max disappeared that night. Sarah was alone, staring at her reflection in the cursed glass. Her doppelganger stared back, its smile spreading slowly, unnaturally. "Your turn," it whispered. Trembling, Sarah asked her final question: "How do I end this?" The mirror's surface darkened, and a vision unfolded. She saw herself smashing the mirror, not with force, but with fire. She grabbed a can of lighter fluid and doused the frame, striking a match with shaking hands. As the flames consumed the mirror, agonized screams filled the air, and shadowy figures clawed at the glass from the inside, trying to escape. The mirror cracked and collapsed into ash, and the room fell silent. Sarah's friends never returned. The house was empty, except for her. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, she caught glimpses of their faces in every reflective surface: windows, water, her own eyes. The mirror was gone, but its game was not over. And Sarah knew, deep down, that she was next. The town of Ashwood wasn't on the map. Harper, Mason, and Elena discovered it by accident when a detour led them off the highway into the heart of nowhere. The streets were eerily quiet, the buildings weathered but intact, as if abandoned mid-breath. A rusted sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to Ashwood. Population unknown." "Creepy," Elena muttered, glancing at the faded letters. "Let's just gas up and go," Mason replied. Their car, an old sedan, was running on fumes. The gas station's pumps were manual, the kind Mason hadn't seen outside of movies. While he fiddled with the pump, Harper wandered into the general store next door. The shelves were stocked with dust-covered cans and faded boxes of cereal. Behind the counter stood a man in a tattered uniform, staring blankly out the window. "Excuse me," Harper said. "Do you have a restroom?" The man turned his head slowly, his eyes glassy. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. Harper frowned. "Excuse me?" "Before midnight. Leave before midnight." His voice cracked as he repeated the warning, a note of desperation seeping into his tone. By the time the car was ready, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the deserted streets. "We should keep driving," Harper said, her voice tight. The guy in the store was weird. He said something about midnight. Elena, looking at the darkening sky, hesitated. "We're in the middle of nowhere. We'll find a motel closer to the highway." But as they turned the key, the car refused to start. Mason cursed, popping the hood. He tinkered with the engine as the minutes ticked by. Then the clock struck 12. The first thing they noticed was the heat. It came out of nowhere, oppressive and suffocating. Then the air filled with the acrid stench of smoke. Harper looked up and gasped. Flames erupted from the rooftops, spreading unnaturally fast. The town was ablaze in moments. "Run!" Mason shouted, but their path was blocked by a wall of fire. The flames didn't spread like normal, they leapt and surged as if alive, forcing the group down a narrow alley. Through the fiery haze, they saw figures moving in the streets. At first, they thought it was other survivors. But as the figures came closer, their charred faces and hollow eyes revealed the truth. These weren't people, they were the dead. The group ducked into an old church, its heavy wooden doors miraculously unscathed. Inside, they found walls lined with faded photographs and old newspaper clippings. Harper grabbed one and scanned the headline, "Inferno claims entire town, hundreds dead in mysterious blaze." Elena picked up another. "Curse or coincidence? Survivors speak of eternal fire." She turned to the others. "This place burns every night. It's repeating itself. How do we stop it?" Mason asked, pacing. Harper pointed to a name that appeared in several clippings, Margaret Hale, accused witch. They pieced together the story. Margaret Hale had been accused of witchcraft and burned alive by the townspeople a century ago. Her final words were a curse, damning Ashwood to burn as she had, night after night, until someone proved her innocence. "We have to find proof she wasn't a witch," Harper said. "How?" Mason asked. "The entire town is on fire." "The church," Elena said. "It's untouched. There must be something here." Rifling through the church archives, they found Margaret's diary. The entries painted a picture of a kind, misunderstood woman who had been scapegoated during a series of unexplained deaths. The final entry read, "They come for me tonight. I am no witch, but their fear will make it so. May they see the truth too late, and may their hatred consume them." "This is it," Harper said. "We have to show this to someone." A loud bang interrupted her. The church doors were glowing red-hot, splintering under the heat. The charred townsfolk were outside, their vacant eyes fixed on the group. "We're out of time," Mason said. They made a break for the town square, clutching the diary. The flames seemed to part around them, as if guiding their path. In the square, they found a statue of Margaret Hale, her face twisted in anguish. "Here!" Harper shouted, placing the diary at the statue's base. The ground trembled. The flames surged higher, then abruptly extinguished, leaving the town in eerie silence. The ghostly figures paused, their expressions softening. One by one, they faded, their forms dissolving like ash on the wind. The clock struck midnight again, but this time, no fire came. By sunrise, the town was still and lifeless, but the oppressive weight had lifted. The trio stumbled back to their car, finding it miraculously functional. As they drove away, Elena looked back. The town of Ashwood was gone, leaving only an empty field. None of them spoke, but they all understood. They'd been given a chance to escape, but Ashwood's curse would linger, waiting for the next unlucky travelers to stumble upon its haunted grounds. Ethan's shift had just begun. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the mall lights flickered on, he settled into his small security booth at the entrance of the sprawling mall. The building seemed to breathe, a hollowed-out labyrinth of closed stores and empty corridors, eerily quiet after hours. Ethan had worked these late-night shifts for months and had grown used to the silence. But tonight, something felt different. A heavy, unsettling stillness hung in the air. He checked his watch. It was just after 11 p.m. The mall was officially closed. No customers, no employees, just him and the monitors that blinked in the dark. His first round was uneventful. He cruised through the empty hallways, eyes scanning the dimly lit spaces. All the doors were locked, and the hallways stretched on like forgotten passages in a haunted mansion. He made his way past the food court, its lights now dim, and glanced into the closed stores, each one dark and silent. But as he reached the back entrance near the storage area, he noticed something strange. The door, which should have been securely shut, was slightly ajar. Ethan frowned. He hadn't noticed it before. Was it possible that someone had gotten inside before closing? He hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed the door open. A chill hit him instantly, as if the air on the other side was somehow colder. The room was dark except for the faint glow of an emergency exit sign. Nothing appeared out of place. Still, Ethan felt his instincts prickle. Something wasn't right. As he turned to leave, he heard it, a soft shuffle. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was here. His heart skipped a beat. He immediately retraced his steps, but the footsteps stopped. The eerie silence returned, more oppressive than before. Ethan's hand moved to the radio on his belt, but before he could speak, a figure darted across the far end of the hall. The man, dark clothing, hooded, his face shadowed, moved with unnatural speed, disappearing into the darkness of the corridor. Ethan's pulse raced. A trespasser? Someone locked in? He wasn't sure, but instinct told him to chase. He moved quickly, following the fleeting shadow through the maze of corridors, his boots echoing against the floor. The man was fast, but Ethan was determined. He called out to the intruder, his voice firm but strained. "Stop. I'll call the police." There was no response, only the sound of hurried footsteps retreating deeper into the mall. Panic gripped Ethan's chest. This wasn't just a prank, something felt wrong. The man wasn't running for the exit. He was moving deeper, as though he knew the mall better than Ethan did. The chase continued through the twisting, empty hallways, past abandoned stores and darkened offices. Every time Ethan thought he had cornered the figure, it vanished into the shadows, always one step ahead. His breath came harder now, his legs burning with exhaustion. His flashlight flickered erratically, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Suddenly, the man stopped. Ethan, adrenaline pumping, slowed his approach. He didn't know why the man had stopped, but his gut told him this was no accident. The intruder wasn't running anymore. Ethan cautiously stepped forward, calling out one last time. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" From the shadows, the figure turned. For the first time, Ethan saw his face, a pale, gaunt expression, eyes wide and hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. His lips curled into a twisted, unsettling smile. He didn't answer Ethan's questions. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something metallic, glinting in the dim light, a knife. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat. He reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the man lunged. The chase turned violent in an instant. Ethan stumbled back, barely dodging the man's strike. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought to keep his distance. The knife slashed through the air, narrowly missing him. The fear coursing through him wasn't just from the knife, it was from something far worse. This man wasn't just a burglar. He was hunting. Ethan darted around a corner, desperate to put some space between them, but the man was relentless. Every step Ethan took, the man followed, the sound of his breathing now joined by the soft, rasping laughter that echoed in the empty mall. Desperation fueled Ethan's movements. He sprinted toward the security office, the only place he knew he could lock himself in. But as he turned a corner, he found himself face to face with the man again. There was no escape. With no time to think, Ethan lunged for the man, trying to knock the knife from his grip. They collided, struggling on the floor. The knife flashed, and Ethan cried out in pain as the blade sliced into his arm. The pain was blinding, but adrenaline kept him moving. In the chaos, they tumbled through a doorway and into a darkened store. Ethan saw his opportunity and pushed the man back, struggling to catch his breath. He grabbed a broken shelf and swung it at the man, knocking him to the ground. But before Ethan could make another move, the man's hand shot out, grabbing his ankle. In a split second, Ethan was pulled to the ground. The knife came down. Ethan's world blurred, and a cold, numb darkness began to creep in. The pain was unbearable, but he couldn't scream. He tried to move, to get away, but his body refused to obey. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness overtook him was the man's face, no longer twisted in a grin, but in something far worse. A look of relief. As if he had finally found what he was looking for. The next morning, when the mall opened, Ethan's body was found. There was no sign of the man. The doors had been locked from the inside, and all the surveillance footage had mysteriously corrupted. No one would ever know what really happened that night, but the mall would never be the same. Every night after that, the security officers would hear it, the sound of footsteps in the dark. Always coming closer.